Imagine a temple of justice transformed into a slaughterhouse in broad daylight. On August 13, 2004, inside a crowded courtroom in Nagpur, India, the unthinkable happened. Over 200 women, armed with hidden knives and stones, descended upon a single man. In 15 minutes of pure, unadulterated fury, they delivered a sentence the state refused to grant. This wasn't just a murder, it was a collective execution of a monster by the very people he had terrorized for over a decade. The story begins in Kasturba Nagar, a marginalized slum located on the fringes of central India. It was a neighborhood forgotten by the law, where poverty and neglect created the perfect breeding ground for a predator. For 13 years, the residents lived under a shadow that never lifted. The streets were narrow, the houses were cramped, and the air was thick with a tension that spoke of a community under siege from a man who considered himself untouchable and above the law. That man was Bharat Kalicharan, known to the world as Akku Yadav. He was a local gangster, a rapist, and a murderer who held the entire slum in a grip of iron fear. Yadav wasn't just a common criminal, he was a psychological tormentor. He didn't just rob, he humiliated. His presence was a constant threat, a dark cloud that dictated when people could walk outside, who they could speak to, and how they had to live their daily lives. The statistics of his reign are staggering and heartbreaking. Over the course of a decade, he was accused of at least 3 murders and over 40 rapes, though many believe the actual numbers were significantly higher. His victims were often young girls and vulnerable women from the Dalit community. He operated with a brazen confidence, knowing that his power was reinforced by the silence of the terrified and the complicity of those who were supposed to protect the innocent. Why was such a man allowed to roam free for so long? The answer lies in the deep-seated corruption of the local police force. It is alleged that Akku Yadav regularly bribed officers, providing them with alcohol and money to ensure that complaints against him were ignored. Victims who dared to enter the police station were often mocked, threatened, or sent back into the hands of their tormentor. The system was not just broken, it was actively working against the victims. In Kasturba Nagar, the fear was palpable. Parents would lock their daughters inside as soon as the sun began to set. Yadav and his gang would roam the streets, drinking openly and picking their next target with impunity. If a family resisted, their home would be ransacked or burned. The women of the slum lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, knowing that any moment could bring a knock on the door that would change their lives forever. The tipping point came in early August 2004. After years of unchecked brutality, the community's patience finally snapped. Yadav had allegedly raped a woman and threatened several others with a knife. Instead of retreating into the shadows as they usually did, the women of the slum began to talk to one another. They realized that their individual fear was being used against them, but their collective anger could become a weapon more powerful than anything Akku Yadav possessed. The catalyst for the courtroom explosion was a sudden legal development. Akku Yadav had finally been arrested, but the community knew how the story usually ended. He would apply for bail, pay his way out, and return to the slum to seek bloody revenge on those who had spoken out. Word spread that a bail hearing was scheduled for August 13. The women knew this was their last chance. If he walked out of that courtroom a free man, they were dead. They didn't plan the murder in a formal meeting, but a silent consensus emerged. On the morning of the hearing, hundreds of women from Kasturba Nagar began their march toward the district court. They didn't come with signs or banners, they came with chili powder hidden in their saris and kitchen knives tucked into their waistbands. They were grandmothers, mothers, and daughters, united by a singular, desperate purpose. They were going to ensure that Akku Yadav never hurt anyone again. The courtroom was packed to capacity. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and tension. When Akku Yadav was led into the room by police, he didn't look like a man in trouble. He looked like a king. He scanned the crowd of women with a mocking smirk, allegedly spotting one of his victims and whispering a lewd threat to her. He believed the police would protect him, and the law would release him, just as they always had. The spark was a single insult. As Yadav stood before the judge, he allegedly taunted the women, showing no remorse for his crimes. One woman, unable to contain years of suppressed trauma, lunged forward. She threw a handful of chili powder directly into his eyes. In an instant, the courtroom erupted into chaos. The blinding red dust filled the air, and the hundreds of women surged forward like a tidal wave, overwhelming the few police officers present in the room. The police, who had been his protectors for so long, were suddenly powerless. They tried to intervene, but they were pushed back by the sheer force of the mob. Some officers reportedly fled the room, terrified by the intensity of the women's rage. Yadav was dragged from the witness stand and pulled onto the floor. The Temple of Justice, designed for orderly proceedings and measured words, was now the site of a brutal, primitive struggle for survival and retribution. For 15 minutes, the courtroom became a blur of motion and sound. Stones were thrown, and knives were drawn from the folds of saris. The women took turns striking the man who had stolen their dignity. Each blow was a decade of pain being released. There was no leader, no singular assassin. It was a collective act of violence where everyone participated and no one stood back. The sound of their screams drowned out the frantic shouts of the court officials. By the time the violence subsided, Akku Yadav lay dead on the courtroom floor. He had been stabbed over 70 times. Stones were scattered around his body, and the white marble of the floor was stained crimson. The women did not run away. They didn't hide their faces or attempt to escape. They stood their ground, covered in blood and dust, breathing heavily in the sudden, eerie silence that followed the storm. They had done what the state could not. The aftermath was as unprecedented as the act itself. The police were under immense pressure to make arrests. How do you prosecute 200 women for a single murder? They eventually rounded up 5 women, charging them with the killing. But the community of Kasturba Nagar responded with a defiance that shocked the nation. Every single woman in the slum came forward to the police station, demanding to be arrested. Their message was clear: if you arrest one, you arrest us all. The "I am the murderer" movement became a national sensation. It forced India to look into the mirror and confront the failure of its own institutions. The case highlighted the intersection of gender, caste, and class. If these women had been wealthy or from a higher caste, would the police have ignored their complaints for 13 years? The lynching was a horrific crime, but to the people of Nagpur, it was a necessary surgery to remove a cancer that was killing them. As the legal proceedings against the women began, the world watched closely. The defense argued that this wasn't premeditated murder, but a collective act of self-defense. They presented evidence of the years of abuse, the ignored police reports, and the constant threats to their lives. The trial lasted for years, hanging over the heads of the women who had returned to their lives in the slum, now finally free from the shadow of the predator who had ruled them. The testimony of the women was harrowing. One by one, they told the court about the daughters they had lost, the dignity that had been stripped away, and the terror they felt every time they saw a police uniform. Their stories painted a picture of a society that had completely abandoned its most vulnerable citizens. In 2012, 8 years after the incident, the court finally reached a verdict. In a move that surprised some but relieved many, all the accused women were acquitted. The judge cited a lack of evidence to pinpoint exactly who delivered the fatal blows, but the underlying message was clear. The prosecution could not prove its case against a community that stood as one. The women walked out of the court as free individuals, their act of defiance technically unpunished by the law. The acquittal did not mean the world condoned vigilante justice, but it was a recognition of the desperate circumstances that led to it. Legal scholars and human rights activists debated the case for years. Was this a victory for justice, or a failure of the rule of law? If the state fails to protect its citizens, do they have a moral right to protect themselves? The story of Akku Yadav became a case study in the limits of legal patience. Today, Kasturba Nagar is a different place. The narrow alleys are still there, and the poverty remains, but the atmosphere of constant terror has dissipated. The memory of the Day of the Knives is still fresh in the minds of the elders. It is a story told to the younger generation, not as a glorification of violence, but as a reminder of the power of a community that refuses to be victims any longer. They reclaimed their streets with blood. However, the case also left a darker legacy. It highlighted the terrifying reality that in many parts of the world, justice is a luxury that only the powerful can afford. For the women of Nagpur, the courtroom was not a place of protection until they made it one through violence. This paradox remains at the heart of the story. To get justice, they had to break the very law they were appealing to for their own safety and survival. The Netflix documentary Indian Predator, Murder in a Courtroom, brought this story back into the global spotlight, forcing a new generation to grapple with its implications. It serves as a haunting reminder that when the system ignores the cries of the marginalized will eventually stop crying and start fighting. The ghosts of August 13 still linger in that Nagpur courtroom, a silent warning to any system that chooses corruption over its duty to protect the people. In the end, the story of Akku Yadav is not just about a predator's death. It is about the moment 200 invisible women became visible to the entire world. They showed that even the most oppressed can find strength in unity. As we look at the failures of justice systems globally, the Nagpur courtroom lynching remains one of the most chilling and complex chapters in true crime history. A story of blood, sorries, and a justice that the law simply couldn't provide.